There are men whose names echo through history not as heroes, but as warnings. Men who had everything this world could offer, yet lost everything in a single moment because they forgot Allah. Imagine standing at the peak of power, surrounded by wealth, influence, and admiration, believing that nothing could ever bring you down. And then suddenly, without warning, everything collapses. These are not just stories meant to be heard and forgotten. They are signs, carefully placed in the Qur'an, meant to shake the qalb, to awaken the soul, and to remind us that no matter how high a person rises, they remain completely dependent on Allah. Thank you for watching Islamic Insight channel. I would truly love to know which country are you watching this from. And if your heart is drawn to reminders like this, then subscribe and stay connected, because these lessons are too important to miss. When you begin to reflect on these stories deeply, something powerful becomes clear. Allah does not mention these men randomly. Each one represents a specific danger that al-insan faces again and again throughout time. It is almost as if these stories are repeating themselves in every generation, just with different names and different faces. There is the danger of wealth that blinds, the danger of power that corrupts, the danger of influence that misguides, and the danger of deception that destroys faith itself. And what makes these stories truly terrifying is not just how they ended, but how they began. None of these men started by openly declaring disbelief or arrogance. It began slowly. A sense of pride here, a small act of ingratitude there, a moment where they chose themselves over obedience to Allah. And step by step, al-qalb becomes harder, the ego grows louder, and eventually a person begins to believe that they are in control of their own destiny. That is the illusion. That is the trap. Because the Qur'an constantly reminds us that Allah gives and takes, raises and lowers, honors and humiliates, all according to His wisdom. These men forgot that truth, and when they did, their scoot was not just inevitable, it was devastating. Among them was a man whose name became a symbol of wealth so extreme that it almost feels unreal. Karun, a man from the people of Musa, peace be upon him, who lived among believers yet chose a path that led him far away from humility and gratitude. Allah describes his wealth in a way that forces you to pause and really imagine it. The keys to his treasures alone were so heavy that even strong men struggled to carry them. Think about that for a moment. Not the treasure itself, just the keys to it required a group of powerful individuals to lift. This was not ordinary wealth. This was abundance beyond imagination, and with that wealth came status, admiration, and influence. People looked at him and saw success. They envied him. They wished for what he had. In their eyes, he had achieved everything that mattered in this world. But what they could not see was what was happening inside his heart. Because wealth, when it is not balanced with gratitude, begins to change a person. It slowly convinces them that they are self-made, that their intelligence, their effort, their knowledge is the sole reason for their success. And this is exactly what Qarun believed. When sincere people advised him, when they reminded him to use his wealth in the path of Allah, to be generous, to remain humble, his response revealed everything about his condition. He said that he had been given this wealth because of knowledge he possessed. Not because of Allah's mercy, not as a test, but because of himself. And that single belief, that dangerous shift from gratitude to arrogance, was the beginning of his end. There is something deeply dangerous about pride when it settles quietly into the heart, because it does not always announce itself loudly. It grows slowly, almost unnoticed, feeding on success, feeding on admiration, feeding on the insan's constant desire to feel superior. Qarun did not wake up one day and suddenly become arrogant. It was a process, a gradual shift in the way he saw himself and the blessings around him. At first, wealth may have felt like a gift, something to be grateful for, something to use wisely. But over time, that sense of gratitude began to fade, replaced by a subtle but powerful belief that he was different, that he was more deserving, that his knowledge and effort placed him above others. This is how arrogance works. It does not just make a person feel proud, it rewrites their entire understanding of reality. It convinces them that they are the source of their own success. The people around him tried to bring him back. They spoke with sincerity, reminding him not to let his wealth corrupt his heart, urging him to seek the hereafter with what Allah had given him and to do good just as Allah had been good to him. These were not harsh words, they were gentle reminders filled with concern. They were trying to save him before it was too late. But when arrogance takes root, even the most sincere advice begins to feel like an attack. Instead of reflecting, Qarun dismissed them. Instead of humbling himself, he doubled down on his pride. His response was chilling in its simplicity. He claimed that everything he had was because of knowledge he possessed. In other words, he believed he had earned it entirely on his own. No acknowledgement of Allah, no recognition of divine fadl, just himself. That statement was not just arrogance, it was a complete distortion of truth. Because no matter how intelligent a person may be, no matter how skilled or hard-working, the very ability to think, to act, to succeed, all of it comes from Allah. The opportunities, the circumstances, the unseen protection from failure, these are not things a person controls. But Qarun could no longer see that. His wealth had blinded him. It had created a barrier between his heart and reality. And this is what makes his story so powerful, because it exposes a weakness that exists in every human being. The temptation to take credit for blessings while forgetting the one who gave them. As his pride grew, so did his display of wealth. The Qur'an paints a vivid image of him coming out before the people in all his splendor. It was not enough for him to be wealthy. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be admired. And when people saw him, many of them were captivated. They began to say that they wished they had what Qarun had, that he was truly fortunate. This moment is important, because it shows how easily people can be deceived by appearances. From the outside, Qarun looked successful, powerful, enviable. But those who had knowledge, those who understood the reality of this dunya, responded differently. They reminded others that what Allah has prepared for those who believe and do righteous deeds is far better. They saw beyond the surface. They understood that wealth without gratitude is not a blessing, it is a test that can destroy a person if they fail it. And then came the moment that changed everything. There was no long warning, no gradual decline, no opportunity for Qarun to recover his position. Allah's justice does not always unfold slowly. Sometimes it arrives suddenly, decisively, leaving no room for escape. The Alad itself, the very ground beneath his feet, became the instrument of his downfall. Imagine the shock, the confusion, the terror, as the earth began to swallow him along with his home and everything he owned. All that wealth, all those treasures, all that pride, none of it could save him. The same Allah that had supported him, that he walked on with confidence, turned against him by the command of Allah. This was not just a physical destruction, it was a complete humiliation. Qarun, who once stood above others, was pulled down into the depths of the earth. Qarun, who believed he was self-sufficient, was shown in the most undeniable way that he had no power at all, and perhaps the most striking part of this moment is how absolute it was. The Qur'an makes it clear that there was no group to help him, no force to rescue him, no second chance. He was gone, along with everything he had spent his life accumulating. Just like that. Those who had envied him the day before were left in shock. The nafs that once wished for his status now recoiled from it. They began to say that it is truly Allah who extends provision to whom He wills and restricts it. They realized how close they had come to falling into the same trap. This shift in their understanding is a powerful reminder. Sometimes it takes witnessing the downfall of others for people to recognize the reality of their own situation. The story of Qarun is not just about a man who was destroyed because of wealth. It is about the deeper danger of forgetting where blessings come from. It is about how quickly success can turn into ruin if the heart is not anchored in gratitude. It is about the illusion of control that al-insan clings to, believing that they are the architects of their own fortune, when in reality they are completely dependent on Allah at every moment. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how relevant this story remains. The same mindset exists today. People measure success by wealth, by status, by visibility. They admire those who appear to have everything, often without questioning how those blessings are being used. And just like in the time of Qarun, there are always voices of wisdom reminding others to stay grounded, to remain grateful, to prioritize the hereafter. But those voices are often ignored, drowned out by the noise of pride and desire. In the end, Qarun's story leaves us with a question that is impossible to ignore. When blessings come into our lives, how do we respond? Do we recognize them as gifts from Allah, using them in ways that bring us closer to Him? Or do we begin to see them as proof of our own greatness, slowly drifting into the same mindset that led to Qarun's destruction? Because the Allah that swallowed him is still beneath our feet, and the lesson remains as real today as it was then. There is a kind of evil that does not always stand at the front, does not always make the loudest claims, and does not always wear the crown. It operates from the shadows of power, standing beside those who lead, strengthening them, protecting them, and helping their voom spread further than it ever could alone. This is where the story of Haman becomes deeply unsettling, because he was not the one claiming to be a god, yet he played a critical role in making that claim seem real to others. He was close to Pharaoh, trusted, influential, and deeply embedded in the machinery of oppression. And sometimes, the one who enables tyranny can be just as dangerous as the one who declares it. Haman represents a type of person that appears in every era, someone who aligns themselves with power, not because it is right, but because it benefits them. He saw Pharaoh's authority, his assitrate over people, his ability to command without question, and instead of challenging it, he chose to support it. This choice was not passive. It required active participation, planning, and loyalty to falsehood. It meant standing beside a man who openly rejected the truth brought by Musa, peace be upon him, and helping maintain the illusion that Pharaoh's authority was absolute. When Musa came with clear signs, with miracles that could not be denied, with a message calling people back to the worship of Allah alone, Pharaoh did not stand alone in rejecting him. He had people like Haman reinforcing his motive, validating his arrogance, and strengthening his resistance. This is what makes the role of Haman so chilling. He was not ignorant. He witnessed the same signs. He heard the same message. He saw the same truth unfold before his eyes. Yet instead of submitting, instead of reflecting, he chose to remain loyal to power. And this is a critical lesson because truth does not always fail due to lack of clarity. Sometimes it fails because people choose their interests over their iman. Haman's position gave him influence, and that influence became a tool used to uphold falsehood. He became part of a system that oppressed, deceived, and led people away from Allah. And then there comes a moment in the Qur'an that captures the peak of this arrogance, a moment that feels almost unbelievable in its audacity. Pharaoh turns to Haman and commands him to build a towering structure, something azim, something that would reach into the sky. But this was not an act of curiosity or exploration. It was mockery. Pharaoh said he wanted to reach the God of Musa, as if Allah could be accessed through physical elevation, as if divinity could be challenged by human construction. And Haman did not question this command. He did not hesitate. He did not remind Pharaoh of the absurdity of such a request. Instead, he accepted it. Think about what this represents. A human being standing on earth, attempting to build his way toward the heavens in order to confront the creator of the heavens. It is arrogance pushed to its absolute limit. And Haman, with all his intelligence, his position, his awareness, became the one tasked with making this arrogance a reality. He was not just a witness to Pharaoh's delusion, he became an active participant in it. Brick by brick, effort by effort, he contributed to a project that symbolized the insan's ultimate rebellion against Allah. This is how dangerous influence can be when it is not guided by truth. Haman had the ability to shape decisions, to influence outcomes, to either support justice or strengthen oppression, and he chose the latter. He chose to use his skills, his knowledge, and his position to build something that stood as a monument to disbelief. And perhaps what is most unsettling is how normal this must have seemed to him. When a person is surrounded by falsehood long enough, when they constantly justify it, defend it, and benefit from it, it begins to feel acceptable. The line between right and wrong becomes blurred, and actions that should shock the conscience become routine. The story forces a difficult reflection. How often do people find themselves in positions where they are not the ones leading wrongdoing, but they are supporting it in some way? Maybe through silence, maybe through compliance, maybe through active involvement. Haman's role shows that standing beside falsehood, even if you are not the one declaring it, still carries immense responsibility. Because without people like him, oppression struggles to survive. It is sustained by those who enable it, who normalize it, who give it structure and strength. And then there is the deeper layer of Pharaoh's command itself, this idea of building upward to challenge what is above. It reflects a misunderstanding of reality that arrogance often creates. Pharaoh believed that power was something physical, something measurable, something that could be reached or confronted through human means. He reduced the concept of divinity to something that could be tested, questioned, even challenged through material effort. And Haman, instead of correcting this distorted view, helped bring it to life. This moment is not just about a tower. It is about a mindset that believes human capability can rival divine authority. A mindset that places intellect, technology, and construction above humility and submission. And this mindset is not limited to the past. It appears again and again, in different forms, in different societies, whenever people begin to believe that they are no longer Haja to Allah, that they can control everything, that they can define truth on their own terms. Haman's involvement in this act is what cements his place among those who are warned against. He was not forced into this role. He chose it. He embraced it. He used his abilities to serve arrogance rather than truth. And in doing so, he became part of one of the most maruf examples of collective defiance against Allah. The story does not need to describe every detail of what was built or how high it reached. That is not the point. The point is the intention behind it, the arrogance that drove it, and the blindness that allowed it to happen. Because when a person reaches a level where they no longer see any limit to their power, where they begin to mock the very idea of accountability before Allah, they have already set themselves on a path that leads to destruction. Haman's legacy is not just that of a man who stood beside Pharaoh. It is the legacy of someone who chose influence over truth, loyalty over iman, and power over humility. It is a reminder that being close to authority does not elevate a person if that authority is built on falsehood. In fact, it can pull them deeper into darkness. And the most terrifying part is that people like Haman rarely see themselves as wrong. They believe they are simply doing their job, fulfilling their role, maintaining order. But when that role is tied to injustice, when that order is built on oppression, then every action becomes part of an Akbar chain of wrongdoing. And so the question remains, not just about Haman, but about anyone who hears this story. If placed in a similar position, surrounded by power, given influence, faced with a choice between truth and benefit, what would we do? Because the story is not just about a man from the past. It is about a pattern that continues, a warning that remains, and a reality that still unfolds in different forms, waiting for those who are willing to reflect. There comes a moment in every story of arrogance where illusion collapses and reality strikes with a force that cannot be resisted. For Pharaoh and Haman, that moment did not arrive gradually. It came suddenly, decisively, in a way that left no room for denial, no space for escape, and no opportunity to reclaim what had been lost. After all the signs that had been shown to them, after witnessing miracles that should have shattered any doubt, after repeated warnings through Musa, peace be upon him, they still chose to persist in their defiance. This is what makes their nihayat so powerful, because it was not dhulm done in ignorance, it was rejection done in full awareness. The sea itself became the stage for their final moment. Imagine the scene, the children of Israel standing before the water, trapped, with Pharaoh's army approaching behind them, confident, powerful, convinced that victory was inevitable. Pharaoh, who had declared himself the highest authority, who had oppressed an entire people, who had mocked the truth and commanded acts of arrogance like building toward the heavens, now stood at the edge of what seemed like a simple pursuit. To him, this was just another demonstration of his control, another opportunity to crush those who opposed him. And Haman was there, part of that same system, sharing in that same confidence, bound to the same fate. But what happened next shattered everything they believed about power. By the command of Allah, the sea parted. Not in a subtle way, not in a way that could be explained away, but in a clear, undeniable miracle. Walls of water stood on either side, creating a path through what should have been impossible to cross. For the believers, this was salvation. For Pharaoh and those who followed him, it became a test that exposed the depth of their arrogance. Instead of pausing, instead of reflecting on what they were witnessing, instead of recognizing that they were standing before a sign far beyond human capability, they continued forward. This is the blindness that arrogance creates. Even when the truth is right in front of a person, they refuse to see it. They entered the path through the sea with the same confidence that had defined their lives, believing that nothing could stop them. But the moment they were fully within it, the command came and the sea returned to its natural state. The same water that had opened to allow passage now closed over them completely. In an instant, their strength, their numbers, their weapons, their authority all became meaningless. There was no structure to hold on to, no Alad beneath their feet to support them, no army to defend them. Just overwhelming water, engulfing them from every side. And in that moment, when Pharaoh realized that death was certain, when the illusion of control finally broke, he tried to declare belief. He claimed that he believed in the Lord of the children of Israel, but this was not the belief of sincerity. It was the desperation of someone who had run out of options. It was too late. A lifetime of arrogance cannot be undone by a final moment of fear. Allah had given him countless opportunities, signs after signs, chances to turn back, but he had rejected them all. And now, at the very edge of destruction, when the consequences were unavoidable, his words carried no weight. Haman, who had stood beside him, who had supported him, who had helped sustain this entire system of oppression, shared in that same fate. There was no distinction made in that moment between the one who led and the one who enabled. Both were swallowed by the same water, both reduced to the same nihayat, both stripped of everything that once made them appear powerful. And this is where the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Supporting dhulm does not protect a person from its consequences. Being close to power does not guarantee safety. In fact, it can tie a person's fate directly to those they choose to stand beside. What remains after them is not their wealth, not their structures, not their claims of authority. What remains is their story, preserved as a warning. A reminder that no matter how strong a system may appear, no matter how deeply rooted oppression may seem, it can be undone in a single moment by the command of Allah. And for those who reflect, it becomes clear that the true qut is not in armies or influence, but in submission to the one who controls all things. And then, as the dust of that story settles, another figure emerges, one whose danger is of a completely different nature. Not a king, not a ruler, not someone commanding armies, but someone who understood people, who understood how to influence hearts, how to shape belief, how to create confusion where there should have been clarity. His name was As-Samiri. His story begins at a time when the people had already witnessed incredible miracles. They had seen the sea part. They had seen Pharaoh destroyed. They had been saved by Allah in a way that left no doubt about the truth of Musa's message. Their hearts should have been firm, their faith unshakable. But this is where another kind of test appears, not one of external oppression, but one that comes from within the community itself. When Musa, peace be upon him, left his people temporarily, trusting that they would remain steadfast, Samiri saw an opportunity. This is what makes his story so unsettling. He did not confront them with open disbelief. He did not declare war against their faith. Instead, he used subtlety, creativity, and manipulation. He collected gold from the people and crafted it into a calf, something familiar, something that held a certain visual appeal. But he did not stop there. Through means that are described in the Qur'an, he produced something that created a sound, giving the illusion that this object had life, that it was worthy of attention, even reverence. And this is where the real danger lies. Because people are not always led astray by something that looks obviously false. Often, it is something that feels convincing, something that appeals to their senses, something that creates doubt in a moment of doubt. Samiri understood this. He did not force anyone to follow him. He presented something that captured their attention, that stirred their curiosity, that made them question what they knew. And slowly, people began to fall into it. Despite all they had witnessed, despite the miracles that should have anchored their faith, a large number of them began to worship the calf. It is difficult to imagine, and yet it reflects a reality about human nature that is deeply uncomfortable. Even after clear truth has been shown, even after powerful experiences that should strengthen Iman, people can still be led astray if their hearts are not firmly grounded. What Samiri did was not just the creation of an idol. It was the creation of confusion. He blurred the line between truth and falsehood. He introduced doubt where there should have been certainty. And in doing so, he became responsible for leading an entire group of people away from the path they had just been guided to. This kind of influence is perhaps more dangerous than open oppression because it does not come with clear warning signs. It does not look like an enemy. It looks appealing, even harmless at first, and by the time its true nature becomes clear, the damage has already been done. The story forces a deep reflection. It shows that guidance is not something that can be taken for granted. It must be protected, nurtured, and constantly reinforced. Because there will always be voices like Samiri's, offering alternatives, creating doubt, presenting illusions that challenge what is true. And without strong Iman, without knowledge, without constant remembrance of Allah, even those who have witnessed truth can begin to slip. So the transition from Pharaoh and Haman to Samiri is not a shift from danger to safety. It is a shift from one kind of test to another, from external oppression to internal deception, and both are equally capable of leading a person to destruction if they are not recognized for what they truly are. What makes deception truly terrifying is not how loudly it announces itself, but how quietly it slips into the heart. It rarely arrives as something obviously false or clearly dangerous. Instead, it presents itself in a form that feels familiar, even comforting, something that does not immediately trigger resistance. This is exactly how Samiri succeeded. He did not come to the people with a direct rejection of Musa, peace be upon him, nor did he openly call them to abandon everything they believed. He understood that such an approach would fail. Instead, he worked through suggestion, through symbolism, through creating an emotional and sensory experience that blurred the line between truth and illusion. The Ines had already gone through an intense journey. They had been oppressed, then saved in a miraculous way, and now they were in a state of transition, still processing everything that had happened. This kind of moment, where certainty has not yet fully settled into the heart, can be a nuqtat daf. Samiri recognized this. He saw that while their eyes had witnessed miracles, their hearts still needed strengthening. And that gap, that fasila between seeing and fully believing, became the space where his deception took root. When he crafted the calf, it was not just a physical object. It was a psychological tool. Gold itself carries a certain attraction. It shines, it draws attention, it symbolizes value and beauty. By using something people already admired, he ensured that the object would immediately capture their interest. But he went further. Through a method mentioned in the Qur'an, he created a sound from it, something that gave the illusion of life. This was critical, because humans are naturally drawn to things that appear alive, things that seem to respond, things that feel real. By giving the calf this feature, he transformed it from a simple object into something that could emotionally engage the people. And then came the suggestion, the subtle shift in narrative. He presented this calf not as something new, but as something connected to what they already knew. This is how deception becomes powerful. It does not replace truth entirely, it distorts it. It takes elements of what is familiar and reshapes them in a way that leads people away without them realizing it immediately. The people began to gather around it, drawn by curiosity, by fascination, by the way it seemed to come alive before them. And slowly, that curiosity turned into acceptance, and acceptance turned into worship. It is easy to look at this moment and wonder how people who had just witnessed such miracles could fall into something like this. But that question reveals a misunderstanding of human nature. Seeing truth is not always enough. Experiencing something powerful does not guarantee that it will remain rooted in the heart. Iman requires constant reinforcement. It requires knowledge, reflection, and a conscious effort to stay connected to Allah. Without that, even the strongest experiences can fade, and when they do, the heart becomes vulnerable. Samiri's deception shows that misguidance often operates through layers. It begins with something small, something that feels harmless. A question, a doubt, an alternative perspective. Then it builds, slowly, gradually, until the person finds themselves in a position they never imagined. And by that point, it becomes much harder to turn back, because the insan has already invested emotionally and mentally into the falsehood. What makes this even more dangerous is that Samiri did not need to force anyone. The people chose to follow. This is a critical point. Misguidance is rarely about compulsion. It is about influence. It is about presenting something in a way that people willingly accept. And once they accept it, they begin to defend it, to justify it, to normalize it. This is how entire communities can shift away from truth without realizing the depth of what has happened. And then comes the moment of confrontation. Musa, peace be upon him, returns and sees what has taken place. The reaction is immediate, intense, and filled with rightful anger. Not because of personal betrayal, but because of the azim khat that had occurred. The people who had been saved, guided, and blessed had turned towards something false in his absence, and at the center of it all stood Samiri, the one who had initiated this entire deviation. When Musa confronted him, the truth of Samiri's actions became undeniable. There was no longer any illusion, no more room for confusion. The calf was exposed for what it truly was, an object with no power, no divinity, no ability to benefit or harm. The deception that had once seemed convincing now appeared hollow. This is often how falsehood ends. Once it is brought into the light, once it is examined clearly, it loses the appeal it once had. But the consequences of what Samiri had done could not simply be erased. Leading people astray is not a small matter. It is not just a personal mistake. It affects others, it spreads, it creates damage that extends beyond the individual. And this is why his punishment was so unique, so deeply symbolic, and so lasting. He was told that his punishment in this life would be isolation. He would go through the rest of his existence saying, "Do not touch me." Imagine the weight of that. A person who once influenced an entire group, who stood at the center of attention, now reduced to complete separation. No connection, no closeness, no normal interaction. It is as if the very ability to be part of a community was taken from him. This punishment reflects the nature of his crime. He had disrupted the spiritual unity of the people, introduced confusion, and broken the connection they had with truth. And now he would experience a form of disconnection himself. It is a powerful reminder that actions have consequences that often mirror the harm they cause. But it does not end there. The Qur'an makes it clear that his accountability extends beyond this life. There is a promise of further punishment, something that cannot be escaped, something that will confront him in the hereafter. This adds another layer to the warning, because while some consequences are visible in this dunya, others are delayed, waiting for a time when every action will be fully accounted for. Samiri's story leaves behind a legacy that is both subtle and deeply unsettling. It is not just about a man who created an idol. It is about the mechanisms of deception, about how easily people can be influenced when their foundation is not strong, about how quickly truth can be distorted when it is not protected. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: the greatest threats to Iman are not always external enemies or obvious acts of opposition. Sometimes they come in the form of ideas, influences, and voices that seem appealing, that feel reasonable, that slowly guide a person away without them realizing it. That is why vigilance is necessary. That is why knowledge is essential, and that is why the connection to Allah must be constantly renewed. There is a trial that has not yet come, a figure whose story does not belong to the past, but to a future moment that will shake the very foundation of Iman across the world. Unlike Karun, unlike Haman, unlike Samiri, this is not someone whose end we look back on with reflection. This is someone whose arrival is still ahead, whose fitnat has been described with such intensity that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, warned his al-Ummat about it more than any other trial. This is the Dajjal, a man whose appearance will not just test people externally, but will challenge the deepest layers of belief within the heart. What makes this warning so powerful is how consistently it appears in authentic narrations. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not mention the Dajjal casually or occasionally. He emphasized it repeatedly, teaching his companions to seek protection from this trial in their daily prayers, as reported in Sahih narrations. This alone tells you something critical. There is no trial in human history, no temptation, no deception that compares to what this figure will bring. And when you begin to understand why, it becomes clear that this is not just about fear. It is about preparation. The Dajjal will not come as an obvious enemy. He will not arrive in a way that immediately causes people to reject him. In fact, his greatest strength will be how convincing he appears. The Prophet described that he will be given abilities that will seem extraordinary, things that will look like miracles to those who witness them. He will command the sky, and it will appear to rain. He will call upon the Alad, and it will seem to produce vegetation. He will have something that appears to be paradise and something that appears to be fire, yet the reality will be the opposite. These are not small tricks. These are overwhelming displays that will challenge a person's perception of reality itself. And this is where the danger reaches its peak, because human beings are naturally drawn to what they can see, what they can experience, what they can measure. When something extraordinary happens in front of them, it creates a powerful emotional response. It feels undeniable. It feels real. And the Dajjal will use this to its fullest extent. He will not just present ideas, he will present experiences that seem to confirm his claims. This is what makes his fitna unlike anything before. It will not just be intellectual, it will be deeply psychological and sensory. But beyond all of this, the most terrifying aspect is his claim. He will claim to be divine. He will stand before people and call them to believe in him as their Lord. And for many, this will not feel as absurd as it sounds. Because when someone appears to control elements of the world, when they seem to have power over life and provision, when they present themselves with confidence and authority, it can blur the lines in the mind of those whose iman is not firm. This is why the Prophet warned that even strong believers will find this trial difficult. Imagine a person who has not built a deep connection with Allah, who has not grounded their belief in knowledge, who has not trained themselves to distinguish between truth and illusion. When they encounter something that appears to challenge everything they know, their certainty can begin to shake. Doubt can creep in, and once doubt enters the heart, it can spread quickly if it is not addressed. This is why the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, gave very specific guidance. He taught that whoever memorizes and recites the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Kahf will be protected from the Dajjal. This is not random. Surah Al-Kahf itself contains stories that address different types of trials, including the trial of wealth, the trial of knowledge, and the trial of power. Reciting these verses regularly strengthens a person's understanding of these tests, grounding them in truths that cannot be shaken by external illusions. He also taught his companions to seek refuge from the Dajjal in every prayer. Think about that level of emphasis. A daily reminder, repeated constantly, asking Allah for protection from a trial that has not yet even appeared. This builds a mindset of awareness, a recognition that no one is immune, that protection comes only from Allah. The descriptions of the Dajjal also include physical signs, such as the fact that he will be one-eyed and that between his eyes will be written the word kafir, which every believer will be able to recognize, whether they can read or not. This detail is profound because it shows that no matter how convincing his external appearance may be, there will always be a clear sign for those whose hearts are connected to Allah. It is a reminder that truth is never completely hidden. It remains accessible to those who seek it sincerely. And yet, despite all of these warnings, despite all of these protections, the Hadith make it clear that many people will still follow him. Entire groups will be drawn to him, captivated by what he offers, convinced by what they see. This is what makes his trial so terrifying. It is not just about individual failure, it is about widespread deception on a scale that humanity has never experienced before. When you reflect on this, it becomes clear that the story of the Dajjal is not isolated from the stories that came before. It is connected to them. Qarun showed the danger of wealth when it leads to arrogance. Haman showed the danger of supporting falsehood for the sake of power. As-Samiri showed the danger of deception and how easily people can be misled. And the Dajjal combines all of these elements into one overwhelming trial. He will offer wealth and provision, he will display power that appears absolute, and he will use deception in its most advanced form. This is why preparing for this trial is not something that can be delayed. It is not about knowing the details alone, it is about strengthening the heart, building a foundation of iman that is not dependent on what is seen or experienced. Because when the Dajjal appears, those who rely only on their senses will struggle. But those who have grounded themselves in the truth of Allah's oneness, who understand that no created being can ever share in his authority, who have trained themselves to recognize the farq between reality and illusion, they will have something that cannot be shaken. And perhaps the most important realization is this: the Dajjal does not create belief or disbelief. He reveals what is already within the heart. His trial exposes the strength or weakness of a person's iman. It brings to the surface what has been built over time. That is why the preparation begins now, long before his arrival, long before his name becomes a reality in the world. Because when that moment comes, it will not be a time to start building faith. It will be a time when faith is tested in its most intense form, and only those who have prepared, who have taken the warnings seriously, who have sought protection from Allah consistently, will find themselves able to stand firm in the face of a deception unlike anything that has ever existed. When the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, warned about the greatest trial that humanity will ever face, he did not leave people in fear without guidance. He gave clear, practical steps, not complicated rituals or unreachable standards, but consistent actions that build a shield around the heart over time. And this is where the beauty of Islam becomes so clear, because protection is not reserved for a select few. It is accessible to anyone who takes it seriously and acts upon it with sincerity. One of the most powerful protections he taught is the recitation of the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Kahf, as mentioned in authentic narrations. These verses are not just words to be memorized and repeated without thought. They carry meanings that directly confront the types of deception the Dajjal will bring. They remind the believer of the reality of guidance, of the unseen, of the importance of holding firmly to truth even when the world around you begins to shift. When a person engages with these verses regularly, reflects on them, understands them, they begin to develop a kind of inner clarity that is not easily shaken. Because when deception appears, it does not always look false on the surface. It can appear attractive, logical, even beneficial. But the one who has internalized these reminders sees beyond the surface. They recognize the patterns. They understand that anything that challenges the oneness of Allah, no matter how impressive it appears, is ultimately false. The Prophet also taught his companions to seek refuge from the Dajjal in every prayer. Think about the consistency of that act. Every single day, multiple times a day, turning to Allah and asking for protection from a trial that may not even come during a person's lifetime. This builds something deeper than awareness. It builds humility. It reminds the believer that no matter how strong they think they are, no matter how confident they feel in their iman, they are still in need of Allah's protection. And that realization alone becomes a source of strength, because it prevents the qalb from becoming arrogant or complacent. Another essential part of this protection is knowledge. Not just surface-level knowledge, but a deep understanding of who Allah is, of His attributes, of His absolute uniqueness. Because when a person truly understands that Allah is unlike anything in creation, that He is not limited, not dependent, not in need of anything, then the claims of the Dajjal lose their power. No matter what he shows, no matter how convincing his displays may seem, they cannot align with the true nature of divinity. This is why strengthening Aqidah is not optional. It is essential. It is the foundation that everything else is built upon. But beyond specific actions, there is a broader lesson here about how a believer should live. The stories of Qarun, Haman, Samiri, and the Dajjal all point toward a central truth. The greatest dangers are not always external. They are internal. Pride, attachment to wealth, desire for power, susceptibility to influence, these are the things that open the door to misguidance. And protecting oneself from these is not something that happens overnight. It is a continuous process. It requires self-reflection, honesty, and a willingness to correct oneself before it is too late. It is easy to look at these figures and see them as distant, as extreme examples that do not relate to everyday life. But that would be a mistake, because the same qualities that led to their downfall exist in smaller forms within people today. A person may not have the wealth of Karun, but they can still feel pride over what they have. They may not stand beside a tyrant like Haman, but they can still support injustice in subtle ways. They may not create idols like Samiri, but they can still be influenced by ideas that pull them away from truth. And while the Dajjal has not yet appeared, the world is already full of distractions and deceptions that test iman in different ways. This is why these stories are not just warnings, they are mirrors. They force a person to look inward and ask difficult questions. Where do I stand? What influences me? What do I prioritize? What am I willing to compromise? Because the path to misguidance does not begin with a major decision. It begins with small choices, repeated over time until they shape a person's direction completely. And then there is the final reality that ties all of this together, the certainty that no matter how powerful a person becomes, no matter how convincing deception may appear, everything returns to Allah. Qarun was swallowed by the earth. Pharaoh and Haman were overtaken by the sea. Samiri was isolated and marked by his actions. And the Dajjal, despite the Azim trial he will bring, will ultimately be defeated. None of them escape accountability. None of them succeed in the end. This is where hope comes in, because these stories are not meant to leave a person feeling overwhelmed. They are meant to anchor the heart in certainty. No matter how chaotic the world becomes, no matter how strong falsehood may appear, it is always temporary. Truth remains, and those who hold on to it, even when it is difficult, even when they feel alone, are the ones who are truly successful. So the question is not whether these warnings are real. The question is how a person responds to them. Do they listen and reflect, allowing these lessons to shape their actions? Or do they hear them and move on, assuming they will never be tested in the same way? Because the reality is, every person will face their own version of these trials. It may not look the same, it may not come in the same form, but the essence is there. And in the end, what will matter is not how much a person had, or how powerful they seemed, or how convincing their arguments were. What will matter is whether they recognized the truth when it was presented to them, whether they remained humble in the face of blessings, whether they stood firm when deception appeared, and whether they turned back to Allah before it was too late. Because the warnings are clear, the patterns have been shown, the outcomes have been revealed, and the path forward has been made known for those who are willing to see it.